Good afternoon. I'm Yomika Bennett, Executive Director of the New York Charter School Association. Welcome to our weekly webinar. I'm joined today by Susie Corello, Executive Director of the SUNY Charter Schools Institute, David Frank, Executive Director of the Charter Schools Office at New York SED, as well as Angeli Matos, Executive Director, Policy and Operations at New York City Department of Education, Aaron Cochran, Managing Director in the same office, and Corey Callahan from the New York City Charter Center. Today's webinar will follow the same format as in the past. We will begin by hearing from authorizers, fielding questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Then we'll transition to New York City Department of Education specific topics and questions. As a reminder, there are a lot of questions that continue to not have firm answers or where the best answer is to just do your best. Also, depending on the number of questions we have, we may not go the full hour. As in the past, this webinar will be recorded, however, and posted on our website later this evening for your future reference. Just a brief commercial, we're also hosting a deep dive webinar on Thursday this week in partnership with TNTP and ANET to discuss beginning the process to plan for returning to schools from a students for services, not operational perspective. David, Susie, and Aaron will also be joining, so please feel free to send me any questions you'd like to see addressed in advance in that context. And now, back to our webinar. Diving in, David, Susie, and Aaron, welcome. I'd like to open by giving you the opportunity to share any updates. Susie, we'll start with you.
Oh, I thought we'd start with Aaron because DOE always ends up going last. So,
okay.
Aaron,
Aaron.
Awesome. Thank you, Susie. Yeah, so we're always happy to be here. Thank you once again for letting me put on my authorizer hat. We don't have any major updates. We're continuing to look at the remote learning plans that you have submitted, and we are continuing to reach out as we have questions about them and as we need more information. And so that is my update.
Excellent.
Okay, great.
All right. We have been doing a couple of things in the last week or so since I've seen you. I've talked with a number of you, both school leaders and network leaders, really trying to understand what questions and your thinking and planning is around restart whenever that happens. I have no insider knowledge about when restart might happen, but they've been really super useful discussions. And I thank all of you that I've spoken with thus far. And those of you that haven't heard from me yet, you're going to get a reach out just to understand your best thinking so that we can try to be ahead of the game in terms of supports and get some answers as we're moving forward. And I think Thursday's webinar is shaping up to be one that will kick that off really well. We also have gotten a lot of questions about accountability going forward. You know, SUNY's we have 17 schools whose charters time out at the end of June 2021, and Jeff and his team are working furiously to make sure that we understand what the landscape looks like. And I will go back to what's going to be my new mantra. I have learned from Governor Cuomo that if you say what you mean multiple times, that hopefully your intent will get through. So we are supporting, doing some monitoring, but really sharing and preparing and helping you prepare for the future. And so one of those things we know is around renewal. We will be organizing an opportunity for those 17 schools whose charters are up at the end of 2021 to give us some feedback and input. And once we get that, then we'll make some final determinations about renewal. But let me just say with great assurance, our interest here is to support what you're doing. You guys are doing incredible work right now. Every time we have an opportunity to interact with schools, it blows us away how you're continuing to iterate the strong work that you're doing with kids. We want to make sure that we get capture that and give you all the credit you deserve for doing that work, and remain as equitable and as close to renewal as we can possibly be in a world where We know there were no assessments this year, so holding you accountable for something you couldn't take part in is not something we'll be looking to do. So there's the big broad strokes. We will, as quickly as we possibly can, pull together those 17 schools that are up for renewal. And then just fielding some requests. I think both Anna and David have indicated there have been some interesting requests coming from some districts, not necessarily New York City DOE, with regard to asking what your continuity of education plans are and some other pieces. We've had calls with our schools. If you get a reach out from your district about that, please reach out to the Institute, one of the Institute lawyers, Ralph Rossi or Carrie G, and we stand at the ready to help you navigate that really successfully. So that's my update.
All right, thank you. David.
Great. Well, it's always good to see everyone on this call. I really look forward to it. To echo what my fellow authorizers said, we know the work you're doing is challenging and difficult, and we greatly appreciate all of the work that our schools are putting into continuing to close the achievement gap across the state. And we are having a call with our renewal schools on the 11th of May to talk about our process and expectations and to work on this collaboratively. So we're excited about that. Also, as Susie mentioned, we have heard from a number of schools that some districts are reaching out to them and asking for their continuity of learning plans. And we are very happy that districts are interested in what our charters are doing. And we always think that you get more flies with honey than vinegar. So we do encourage you to share the work you're doing, although there are nuances as to whether districts are entitled to it or not. Certainly, if districts are threatening to withhold funding, please reach out to us as quickly as possible. I have a meeting with the commissioner tomorrow to talk about this issue. So it's definitely something that is on our radar. But please keep us in the loop, and we continue to work with SUNY closely on this. We also we've also been working on ensuring continuity of funding for charter schools. And so we were very glad to be able to actually submit a waiver request to the US DOE last week, where we asked to reallocate some of our CSP money. We have one of the largest CSP grants in the country. We have $95.5 million. And we want to take some of that money and allocate some funding to education corporations, charter school education corporations across the state to help fund some of the expenses that you've had as you transition from or have transitioned from brick and mortar instruction to remote instruction. So we've been keeping busy. I'm really glad that Kentia brought this up. I hope all of you have seen the email from the State Ed Department this week regarding privacy officer, and all schools pursuant to Education Law 2D, which was passed in 2018, I believe, maybe sooner, but that your school is required to have a data privacy officer. And so SCD sent an email requesting that your school identify that privacy officer by the 8th of May. And I'll be following up with everyone, but we do ask that you take a look at that email. And if you have any questions, you can speak to your legal counsel or us here at the State Education Department. And I'll forward that email around. Privacy officers fulfill the obligations of schools under Education Law 2D to, one, monitor that your school is compliant with applicable laws and regulations, but also to hear any complaints. And so it's very similar to each school is required to have, for example, a McKinney-Vento officer to ensure that you're complying with the requirements of McKinney-Vento. It's a very similar requirement. And so if you don't know who your school's McKinney-Vento officer is, Or if you don't know who your school's data privacy officer is, now is a great time to start thinking about that.
All right, great. Thank you, David. Just wanted to confirm this. May 8th is the deadline for schools to let SED know who that data privacy officer is. Is that correct? And you'll send out the email.
That is correct. And you know, I would never say make it up, but you know, it's bad. It's bad. Look at Anna's face there. You know, it's
leave it at that. No.
Right. Get someone in there. Talk to your counsel. You know, we would love to be able to say that 100% of the charter schools across the state have a data privacy officer.
And I'll just say quickly, David, I'm laughing because I participated as a charter representative in a working group of data folks from districts and RICs as this was being worked out. And so I'm happy to share more thoughts in a different forum, but I do think that, David, your analogy about the McKinney-Vento officer is very apt, which is that I think for most schools, this will be someone who is on the operations side of things, who's familiar with your student information management system, and is minimally familiar with issues of data privacy. So I think folks shouldn't freak out, and we can do a deeper dive on this if it's helpful in another forum. But I think it's a helpful flag. And David, I think you're right. It's certainly in the current context of online everything. It will be of particular interest, I think, to folks to make sure that charters are also attentive to these issues, which they certainly are.
And the data privacy officer should be someone who's employed by your school. Yvonne, I certainly can follow up and see if that could be someone who is a employee of the management organization. So I will follow up.
Okay, great. And one thing I just also wanted to clarify, David, for payments for the district, back to the issue, Susie and David, regarding districts attempting possibly to withhold funding. On May 1st, all schools should expect the districts to submit full payment. If they don't, they should let you know. Is that right?
Correct.
Yes. Okay. You know, I'm not a lawyer, nor am I your legal counsel, but I know of no provision of the law or executive order that requires you to, that allows a district to withhold funding based on that. But of course, in the spirit of sharing effective practices, I think that most districts would actually be would be pleasantly surprised to see the robust education continuity plans that you're putting into place. And I was speaking to a school right outside Buffalo about this, and I said, it might be a good idea for you to ask for the district's plan so that learning can happen both ways.
I like that a lot. All right. Thank you for everyone for those updates. David, we're going to stick with you for a second. SAD has recently issued a memo outlining the changes to the accountability regulations for districts in light of the lack of state tests this year. Can you talk a little bit about what the implications are for the memo, and are there future announcements or updates you anticipate related to accountability?
Yes, well, I just shared my screen real quick. This is the memo that went out earlier this week. It's from Assistant Commissioner Harmon, who works with us. And basically, I think the gist of it is that is right here, that the accountability status of schools and charter schools are counted under public schools for this upcoming school year will be the same as the current school year. You know, this is, of course, we want all schools to succeed. These accountability designations are one of many metrics that I know we look at, and I connected with Susie about this earlier today, and it's one of the many, many metrics that they look at. So this is important, but ultimately we would ask that you also pay attention to the performance framework of your authorizer. But basically, the accountability status of your school will be the same next year. SED will not be engaged in ESSA accountability designation monitoring visits. Although, I know many of you, we've spoken many times about the continued monitoring and oversight that we're doing as your authorizer. And I know that SUNY are having ongoing monitoring calls and conversations with their schools. I don't know if they would classify it as that, but, and then there's additional information here about the ins and outs of the changes that are being put into place. I will fully admit I'm not an expert on ESSA accountability, but if you do have any questions, the memo is very kind enough to let you know that here are some information that you can use to reach out to any specific questions. In addition, there will not be, schools will not be targeted, or schools won't be identified as comprehensive support and improvement next year if you're not already. So overall, this is basically a pause of ESSA accountability pursuant to the state's, New York State's waiver through the federal government.
Thank you. Aaron and Susie, do you have any updates or previews for schools you authorized about what to expect regarding accountability and renewals you want to share?
Not anything in addition to what I already shared.
Okay, great. Aaron?
Yeah, I can share a little bit. We are looking into what this means for the schools that are going through renewal next year. And I believe based on the timeline that we're looking at, we may be sharing out what that looks like this summer as we are preparing the normal renewal packages. But we will definitely share more as we know what all of this looks like as we are continuing with our thinking. And I would encourage you to reach out if you have particular questions or concerns, or have any ideas as to things that would be maybe outside the box thinking for things that we should be looking at.
Thank you, Aaron. So we continue to field a lot of questions about grading as well as promotion and retention. So far, you each seem to have encouraged schools to do their best and document their decision-making. If it is possible that school does not resume this year, do you anticipate that any more formal guidance or policy would be forthcoming on these topics? Schools are understandably concerned about communicating decisions and framing it to parents if it's possible things will change. Can any one of you want to provide an opinion or response on that question?
So far, the state education department's stance on this is that promotion decisions are local matter and should be made by the LEA. Of course, charter schools are your own LEA, so that's something that you would have a policy, and you would, if you need to amend your policy for promotion, you should speak to your authorizer. But each school should have criteria by which you are making decisions on promotion. And we would expect you to follow those decisions, those decision points, and apply them uniformly. We've heard from a few schools that through their lotteries, they've received applications from parents who perhaps want their child to go into kindergarten, but the child's currently in kindergarten now. And again, that's a decision that you and your school need to make if that's something that you want to do uniformly. I would just strongly caution you not to make one-off exceptions, that you should have a policy, you should implement that policy uniformly. And I think charter schools have a wide range of flexibility in determining whether or not they should retain students or promote them. And that's not something that we'll be scrutinizing as an authorizer as long as you're following that policy.
Thank you. Susie, Aaron, would you want to respond?
I'm trying to not make go last.
Oh, thank you, Susie. So we definitely agree with David. I think the thing that we would add would be that we know, particularly for charter schools that we authorize or that are sitting in New York City, it can be helpful to know the guidance that is being shared to district schools. because you may have graduating fifth graders that are about to head to a district school. You may have students coming in from eighth grade having attended a district school. So it can be helpful to have that context as you are considering your own guidance for promotion and retention. And so as that guidance is developed, we plan to share it out if it is something helpful for you to consider.
And I would say generally, I was trying to think back on any renewal or evaluation report that we've provided that might have opined or in some way analyzed promotion or retention at any one of our schools in a way that was at all punitive or negative in some way. And I don't think we ever have. And I've also been trying to think about the reasons that we would. So let's take that off of the table. And I will just echo that these are, you are an autonomous organization for a reason. And those are your opportunities and options to make. I've had a couple of conversations with different leaders thinking about time in the summer and how there might be some time in the summer for students who would like to engage in some process of continuous learning, and then they would make some set of promotion decisions beyond that. So I would say we're here to share, so we can start gathering what some of those plans are for schools and share them out, but don't have any expectation.
Okay, great. So now I'm going to turn it over. Are there any questions in the chat that we want to get answered by the group?
Yeah. And at some point, Yomika, I'm going to kick one to you, but I will give you a minute. Folks, we had anticipated the question regarding some of what Governor Cuomo has said recently about cuts to education, but we'll get to that in just a second. So, Aaron, David, Susie, there are a couple of questions that I think very understandably and commendably are looking really far ahead. So to the summer and to next year. So schools that are thinking about either operating during the summer, making resources available during the summer, and then also beginning to think about the parameters for next year and potentially reflecting on lessons learned from the past. I'm not even sure how many weeks, more than I want to give a number to. Thoughts about how things schools should be taking into consideration, thinking about operating or making resources available during the summer, as well as early contingency planning and thinking about next year. And Erin, would you like to lead off?
Yes, thank you. So we are really thinking about this. We know that a lot of schools have been asking about building availability and construction. So we're definitely thinking about it. I think the only thing right now that we would add to probably what you're already considering is folks' energy level, right? Like I'm hearing that we have teachers that are supporting students at midnight writing essays because apparently teachers in New York City are going nocturnal. Teenagers in New York City are going nocturnal. And so there's a lot of like midnight work happening from teachers. So I would just, in addition to all of the really smart thinking I know is happening, just remembering that this really is a marathon and not a sprint. And so as much as possible, consider the energy levels of yourself, your staff, your families, as you're thinking through what all of this might look like.
So I would say thanks, Erin, because I think a number of our schools are trying to understand what their impact will be if they're co-located in New York City DOE space. I mean, we have a few schools that use New York City DOE space throughout the summer on a regular basis. And so there's some history of New York City DOE making that space available. So that would be something we would certainly be willing and interested in supporting if we can, if our schools are so inclined. I think there are a number of the schools that do have their own facilities that may, again, want to make some of that available over the summer, as well as looking at calendars. I have had a couple of conversations, one with a friend who's actually out in Oakland, where they've had year-round schools forever and ever, in thinking about a different kind of schedule, whether that is, having some sort of, I don't know how it works, 10 weeks on, 2 weeks off, and shifting a calendar. The Institute, of course, we ask you to submit your calendar. Nobody's ever actually really submitted a 10-week, 2-week calendar to us. But we'd certainly be willing and interested in doing that if, again, the capacities were there in terms of your human resources, but also in terms of what facilities that you are in. And then just in terms of my crystal ball for the fall and infection rates dropping and staying low, is really, really on the fritz. But I think one of the things that we've been doing through our interviews with schools, and all three authorizers are, I think, working towards a combination survey so that we can understand this better and share out what you've done so proficiently, but is to think about when you made the pivot this year, what are the things, if you have to pivot next year for some reason, what are the lessons learned? I would love to understand this. We'll push out what we are learning through our calls and the survey that's going to come out. What are the lessons learned about the pivot? What are the additional financial expenditures and also staffing expenditures? If you are going to have everybody ready to pivot to an online world, what are the costs for supporting those technologies longer term, et cetera? So we're happy to help folks think through that and have a sense of possibility about how that could work in the future.
Yeah, we think one of the best things that schools can do is create reentry plans and think about the interventions that they plan on providing students to the additional learning time that they're going to provide students, regardless of if you're implementing the best remote program or not. We just know that research shows that online instruction is just not the same. And so how are you going to address the academic needs of students, but then how are you going to address social emotional needs of students? They'll be, when they return to your buildings, they might be without direct instruction for months. And so how are you going to reacclimatize them to your culture? Some of them might have, I've heard from, I was speaking to a school leader earlier this week, or actually late last week, and they were telling me that they lose 2 to 3 aunts or uncles or parents or grandparents almost a day. And so there's a lot of trauma in that community. So what are you going to do to address that trauma and those social emotional needs? We also, we don't think, as an authorizer, I'm not speaking as the state ed department, but wearing my my authorizer hat, as Erin likes to say, that we are, we don't think that now is the time to cut back on instruction. We've had some requests from schools to reduce their schedules for next year, and we're really reluctant to approve that without a very strong rationale as how it's going to contribute to the added instruction and learning of students. So certainly if you're a school that's put in one of those requests, it might not be approved unless you're providing us with a strong rationale as to how you're going to address the 2 areas that I spoke about before. And then think outside the box, use your autonomy and innovate. There's nothing that says you cannot supplement your instruction when you're back in the building with online instruction if you have a program that works, or during the summer. This might this, the work that we're doing now might revolutionize how you provide summer instruction from now until eternity. So those are just my quick thoughts.
Thanks, guys. So Yomika, I will now ask you a question around these questions about funding, some of what the governor's been saying in terms of 50% cuts, 20% cuts, and any expectation or how should charters be thinking about revenue for next year?
Sure. So the governor did over the weekend, in one of his briefings, he mentioned that state education aid could be cut by as much as 50%, and I think later he walked that back to maybe 20%. It's not clear to me that he was referring to aid that was already expected to, New York State was already expected to receive, but I think it is. So I think what he was saying is that basically messaging to the federal government, to the president, right, that if the aid that New York is expecting to receive is not does not come, that education to the schools would be cut. New York State is already expected to receive $1.2 billion approximately in federal CARES Act funding, and that money would go out to schools and as it's sort of baked into the enacted budget. We all know that there's a 5.5% reduction amount that's included in the formula. And speaking with both DOBs, both finance committees in the legislature, when the enacted budget was put together, the idea was that there would be a reduction that schools would see, charter schools would see in their basic tuition amount, and that reduction would be filled, if you will, by federal aid. Without federal aid, there will be a cut, both to I'll say that state education aid overall, charters and districts. So the money that he was talking about is the money that New York that New York is already slated to receive the $1.2 billion, and that's the federal CARES Act funding. It's not a question of, in my mind, whether the state will receive it, but when. And I think the governor was signaling that New York needs it now. The federal government needs to act.
Thanks, Yumika. So Corey, I'll turn it over to you and Anjali to talk about and field some New York City DOE specific questions.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Anjali, where should we start? Wait, I don't have a lot of questions, but I guess one of the things that we all saw was that the DOE related service providers have made the switch over from Zoom to only doing services for speech or OT to either Microsoft Teams or Google Hangouts. And DOE sponsored training yesterday for all charter schools. Are there going to be more trainings for schools, or is there a copy of that webinar that other schools could access if they were not able to make the training? Anjali, you might be on mute if you're speaking.
Hi, Corey.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Talking to myself, wonderful. Okay, so yes, so we have, and apologies by the way for those that were trying to access the training yesterday. We did have an updated platform that we sent out on Sunday, so my apologies if you missed that. So two things, so we are working on just cleaning up the recording, and we'll share that for those of you that missed it. And then second thing is that we are offering more PDs. I just shared the link in the chat. You can sign up directly on that link.
Great. Other questions that have come in have been around the school construction. I think we talked about this last week, but schools, particularly those in co-located space, are trying to work on some construction either right now or in the summer. Are there updates on how co-located charters can get those projects started?
All right, so that's a super good question. We don't have guidance at the moment, but we're working on a plan. We are aware that the office that manages the third-party agreement sent out emails last week that everything was on hold. So we're trying to figure out how schools are going to be moving forward with projects that were already approved. And, you know, if you're a school that has an essential project that's required for pre-opening, if we do open and when we do open, you know, we're also trying to figure out the next steps there. So more to come on that, Corey.
Next question. On pre-K, this is something that came up at another point in one of these webinars. Has there any update from the DOE on the pre-K funding stream? I know this is you know, for the New York City charters that offer pre-K.
Yes, so all payments will be made on time. So we're not expecting any delays or any reductions at the moment. So that is good news.
Okay. And then can you speak a little bit about the virtual hearings that are going to happen for charter schools that are located in New York City that are either going through renewals or revisions?
Yes, so we're continuing to host our renewal and revisions hearings as usual, just virtually. So we've held a few yesterday and have a few others scheduled for the rest of the week. And our plan is to continue to hold those hearings virtually through the rest of this time.
Great. And then I think the one question I saw that was DOE specific in the chat was, have there been issues, is DOE aware of issues of certain grab and go stations running out of food? And is there anything that is being done to address that?
Yeah, that's a good one, Stacy. I saw that you posted that question. It's not on my radar at all. And you know, if you're a school and you're facing that, if parents are reporting that issue to you, please email us right away at charterschools@nyc.gov, and we will be, you know, we can get in touch with the team that's managing the process to ensure that doesn't happen.
And then another question that just came through is about if there are any updates on what the July reconciliation period is going to look like, specifically with respect to special education funding.
Yeah, another good question. So at the moment, we don't have any more details around billing. Right, so we are, you know, working closely with David and with the finance office at SED to figure out how per pupil and FTEs will be calculated for the rest of this year. At the moment, in terms of timeline, we do, you know, we're not anticipating any change to the deadline in the reconciliation. So we expect that the reconciliation will still be due by July 31st, which is in the charter law. Or in the commissioner's regulation. And we anticipate opening the vendor portal a month in advance as usual. And if anything changes, we will let you all know right away.
I don't think I see any other DOE specific questions. So Anjali, unless you have other updates you want to give.
I think two things, Corey. So the first one is around NISTL. So our NISTL deadline is coming up on Friday the 24th. So if you still have funding available, please make sure to spend by the deadline, because you know, if you don't use it, you lose it, essentially. So two quick things related to NISTL around deliveries. So as you know, our buildings are open, right? Our DOE buildings, custodians are in the buildings regularly, but you know, you should still be coordinating closely with the custodian around deliveries, right? So if you know you have a shipment coming in next week, just make sure to, you know, coordinate with them to keep an eye out for your delivery. We've had some schools already report that they're having issues sort of getting, you know, getting deliveries or having, you know, issues coordinating with vendors. If you are one of those schools, please let us know, because we can support you on the custodian end if there's an issue there. And if you're having any issues with vendors, please flag that for us as well. That's around NISTL. And I think that's it, Corey.
One other last question I just saw from Vicky, sorry I missed it before. Is the SCA funding for Reso A movable projects such as science computer carts, will that still happen for fiscal year 20?
I am unsure, but we can come back to that.
One quick question that I think is DOE centric. Corey, I'm not sure if you saw, but Franklin from Voice Charter School is asking all three authorizers to comment on the nature of DOE guidance, especially regarding special education and Zoom. And so, but potentially more broadly, that if there is guidance and maybe guidance from any of the authorizers, what does compliance with guidance mean? And is that going to have any potential implications, negative implications for schools in the future? So if you could all maybe draw a little bit of a distinction between how you see it when you as an authorizer are issuing guidance versus directions or mandates.
I think really quick, I was just going to say, David and Susie, if you want to go first, and then we'll go last, and we'll answer both as an authorizer and as the LEA.
I would say as the SEA, as the state education agency, our position is that the LEA for students with disabilities is the district of location. And so it would be well within the right of the LEA to require that certain service delivery platforms are complied with, particularly as they have responsibility to us and to the federal government to ensure that all aspects of IDEA are being complied with. And it is unreasonable to ask them to devote the resources to vet and ensure and train all of their staff or the staff that they've contracted with to be familiar with such platforms and for them to carry out their legal responsibilities under the law with 351 different platforms potentially. And so, that would be our stance as the SEA.
So it is helpful to always think, especially for students with disabilities, but in a number of categories, about what the intent of the federal government's setting up SEAs and then the state work in terms of LEA. And so we have told our schools that if they make choices outside of that, they're going to need to document why they made those choices and what steps they took to ensure all of the privacy, or as many of the privacy considerations they could mitigate as possible, document it, right? So we've put out guidance about online board meetings and good governance practices. But it is a place where you may have the local education agency who's in charge of the special education work across our schools come to you and give you a different directive. Again, I will say it's always been kind of SUNY's role of, if you need us to kind of talk and have a conversation and try to navigate the nooks and crannies of a policy with a district who's trying to do a really great job, as New York City DOE is trying to do for these kids, or we stand at the ready to help you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think that wraps up our webinar for today. Thank you again for.
Oh, did Anjali want to?
Yeah, I think Anjali is going to weigh in.
Yeah. Sorry, Yamika, I took forever. There's a lot of space there. All right, so really quickly, I just pasted the language that we sent in the C Weekly around this so that you have it handy. I think with my LEA hat on for special education, what we're asking charter schools that are providing teletherapy for special education services with their own staff that they hire is to strongly consider transitioning out of Zoom. So we're not prohibiting that, and I echo David's and Susie's thoughts on that. You know, if you have strong opinions about Zoom, I encourage you to talk to your legal counsel about your next steps. There is no flexibility, however, with transitioning out of Zoom for services or related services that are provided by the DOE or by RSA providers. So, you know, those agencies were informed to transition out of Zoom as soon as possible. And, you know, we do recognize that as soon as possible is not specific. It's very broad and it means something different for everyone. However, you know, the expectation is that those agencies are actively working with your schools to make that transition as soon as possible and as smooth as possible as well, because we do not want any interruption in service. As we mentioned earlier, we are providing more PDs around that transition. So please, you know, if there's training needed that's not in that training calendar that I set before, please reach out and we're happy to coordinate with our ed tech or our education technology team to do more PD if needed. Let's see. Okay, so there's some more technical questions coming in about the DOE instance and Google Meets. We're happy to, you know, we're gonna send that recording and we have those resources ready to share. So please reference those documents and we can come back to those questions if needed in the next webinar. So over to you, Yamika.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you to our panelists for participating again today in our weekly webinar. We look forward to seeing you again. I wanted to remind everyone of our Thursday webinar. It will be at 4 p.m. I've gotten a couple emails about that. Same time, 4:30 p.m. And until then, everyone, take care. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.